morning sun cast long shadows through the bullet holes in Amira's bedroom wall, each ray of light a golden finger pointing to where death had missed her by inches. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, counting the holes for the 100th time. 12 perfect circles, each one a testament to precision that should have killed her. The plaster around each hole was still white with dust, and when she touched the wall, tiny fragments fell like snow onto her bare feet. Outside, the familiar sounds of Damascus had changed overnight. Where once there had been the gentle hum of early morning traffic, the calls of street vendors selling fresh bread, and children's laughter echoing from the courtyard below, now there was only an oppressive silence punctuated by the distant rumble of military vehicles. Amira pressed her ear to the cool wall and listened. Nothing. Even the sparrows that nested in the old olive tree outside her window had gone quiet. Her younger brother Khalil pushed open the door without knocking, his face pale with exhaustion. At 19, he still had the soft features of boyhood, but his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen too much. "Amira, you need to see this," he whispered, his voice cracking on her name. He held her old Nokia phone in his trembling hands, the screen cracked from when she dropped it during last night's attack. "What is it?" She stood slowly, her body still aching from where she'd thrown herself to the floor 12 hours ago. There were bruises on her knees, her palms scraped raw from the rough concrete, and her right shoulder throbbed where she'd hit the wall. Khalil's fingers fumbled with the phone's buttons. "I was trying to call Mama in Latakia to tell her you're safe, but when I looked outside..." He moved to the window, careful to stay to one side, and gestured for her to look. Amira approached the window with the caution of someone who had learned that glass and safety were no longer synonymous. She peered through the gap between the heavy curtains her mother had sewn 3 years ago, before the war had really reached their neighborhood. What she saw made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. The building across the street, a 4-story apartment complex where the Mahmoud family lived, where old Mr. Hassan ran his small grocery on the ground floor, was surrounded. Not by the regular army soldiers they had grown accustomed to seeing, with their mismatched uniforms and tired faces, but by figures in desert camouflage who moved with the fluid precision of dancers. They wore no unit patches, no identifying marks, and their weapons caught the morning light like polished silver. "How many?" she asked, though she was already counting. One on the rooftop of the building to the east, barely visible except for the glint of his scope. 2 at the mouth of the alley. 3 more positioned behind the burned-out car that had been there since the bombing 2 months ago. And those were just the ones she could see. "I count 8, maybe 10, Khalil whispered, "but sister, that's not the strangest part." He pointed to their own building's entrance, 4 floors below. "Look at our door." Amira's heart stopped. There, spray-painted in fresh red paint on the weathered wooden door of their building, was a symbol she had never seen before. A circle with 3 lines radiating from the center, like a simplified sun. The paint was still wet enough that a thin rivulet had dripped down to pool on the threshold where she had stepped thousands of times coming home from her work at the clinic. "When did that appear?" Her voice was barely audible. "It wasn't there when I went to buy bread at dawn. I noticed it when I came back an hour ago." Khalil set the phone on her small desk, next to the medical textbooks she studied by candlelight when the power was out. "Amira, what happened last night? Really happened?" She had told him the story already, but saying it aloud again felt like confessing to a crime she hadn't committed. "I was reading. You know how I sit by the window to catch the light from the street lamp. I heard a car engine, then footsteps on the stairs. Heavy boots, not like the neighbors wear." She touched the wall, where the bullets had torn through. The shooting started without warning. 12 shots, all in a perfect line across the wall where my head would have been if I hadn't dropped my book. "But who were you reading about?" Khalil's question was soft, but it carried the weight of suspicion that had been growing in both their minds since sunrise. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Amira walked to her desk and picked up the book that had saved her life, a thick medical journal, bound in green cloth, its pages yellowed with age. She had found it in the ruins of the university library 3 months ago, when she had gone there looking for anything that might help her treat the wounded who came to the underground clinic where she volunteered. The book was written in English and Arabic, a comparative study of battlefield medicine techniques. But it wasn't the medical content that had made her drop it in shock last night. She opened it to the page she had bookmarked with a dried jasmine flower. There, printed in black and white, was a photograph of a woman in military fatigues standing next to a field hospital tent. The woman had dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, intelligent eyes, and a small scar on her left cheek. The caption read, "Captain Yasmin Al-Rashid, Syrian Army Medical Corps, killed in action 1987, age 32. The woman in the photograph looked exactly like Amira. Not similar, identical. The same high cheekbones, the same shape of the eyes, even the same small mole beside the left ear. It was as if Amira was looking at a photograph of herself in a uniform she had never worn, in a war that had ended before she was born. Khalil leaned over her shoulder to look at the page again, though they had both stared at it for hours after the shooting stopped. "Maybe it's a coincidence," he said, but his voice held no conviction. "Read the article," Amira said, turning the page. The text was dense, written in the formal language of military records. Captain Yasmin Al-Rashid had been a field medic during the Iran-Iraq War, stationed along Syria's eastern border. She had saved over 200 soldiers during her 5 years of service, earning commendations for bravery under fire. But the article's final paragraph was what had made Amira's hands shake as she read it the night before. Captain Al-Rashid was killed by sniper fire while treating wounded soldiers near the town of Deir-ez-Zor. 12 bullets were fired at her position. Military investigators noted the unusual precision of the attack and suspected the involvement of a specialized marksman unit, though no such unit was officially deployed in the area. Her body was never recovered, and she was buried in absentia in Damascus. Khalil sat heavily on her bed, the old springs creaking under his weight. "You think someone believes you're her? That you're connected to her somehow?" Before Amira could answer, they heard the sound that had become the soundtrack of their lives, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. But this sound was different, closer and more rhythmic. Through the thin walls of their apartment, they could hear their neighbors moving around, voices raised in whispered conversations. Mrs. Farah from the apartment next door knocked on their wall, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slower ones, their building's code for danger approaching. Amira knocked back twice to acknowledge, then moved to gather her few valuable possessions: the medical supplies she kept hidden under her mattress, her father's watch, and the small leather journal where she recorded everything she had learned about treating trauma wounds. But as she reached for the journal, she noticed something that made her freeze. There, pressed between its pages where she was certain she had left it blank, was a folded piece of paper. She pulled it out with trembling fingers and unfolded it. The note was written in Arabic, in handwriting that was both elegant and urgent. The unit that killed Yasmin Al-Rashid 37 years ago was never disbanded. They have been watching her bloodline. You are not safe where you are. The symbol on your door marks you for extraction. Trust no one in uniform. A friend who remembers. Khalil read over her shoulder, his breathing shallow. Bloodline. Amira, Mama never mentioned having any relatives in the military. Mama never talks about her family at all, Amira replied, her mind racing through fragments of half-remembered conversations. Their mother, Lila, had always been evasive about her past, claiming that the war had taken too many memories to make sharing them worthwhile. She had no photographs from before her marriage, no stories about grandparents or aunts or uncles. When pressed, she would change the subject, or suddenly remember urgent housework that needed doing. The helicopter sound was growing louder, and now they could hear vehicles on the street below, not the rattling trucks of the regular army, but the smooth purr of expensive engines. Amira stuffed the note into her pocket and grabbed her medical bag, the one she had sewn herself from canvas salvaged from a torn tent. "We need to leave," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she heard footsteps in the stairwell outside their apartment. Heavy, measured footsteps that made no attempt at stealth. Whoever was coming wanted them to know they were there. Khalil moved to the door and pressed his ear against it. 3 people, maybe 4. They're stopping at each floor. His voice was tight with fear. Amira looked around their small apartment, the home where she had lived for 23 years, where her father had taught her to read Arabic poetry by lamplight, where her mother had braided her hair every morning before school. On the shelf above her bed sat her few treasures: a ceramic figurine of a horse that her father had given her for her 10th birthday, a pressed flower from the last Eid celebration they had shared as a complete family, and a small mirror with a crack down the middle that she had never bothered to replace. The footsteps stopped outside their door. A voice called out in Arabic, but the accent was wrong, too formal, like someone who had learned the language from books rather than from mothers and grandmothers. "Miss Al-Rashid, we know you are inside. We wish to speak with you about your research." Amira and Khalil exchanged glances. She had never used the name Al-Rashid in her life. Her family name was Haddad, and it had been for 3 generations as far as she knew. But somehow, these people knew about the book, about the photograph, about the connection she was only beginning to understand herself. "We are here to help you," the voice continued. "Last night's incident was unfortunate. We would like to ensure your safety." Through the thin door, Amira could hear the soft creak of leather, gun holsters, boot straps, the subtle sounds of people accustomed to carrying weapons. She moved to the window again and saw that the marksman across the street had shifted position. They were no longer watching the building randomly. They were all facing her window. The knock on the door came again, more insistent this time. "Miss Al-Rashid, we have information about your mother's family, about why you were given up for adoption, about the real reason Captain Yasmin Al-Rashid's body was never found." Khalil grabbed her arm. "Adoption? Amira, what are they talking about?" But Amira's mind was already racing through the implications, the gaps in her mother's stories. The way Lila sometimes called her by the wrong name in moments of distraction, not Amira, but Yasmin. The medical knowledge that seemed to come to her so naturally, as if she had inherited not just genes but memories. The door handle turned slowly, and they realized with horror that whoever was outside had a key. The safe house that Khalil led her to was nothing more than a basement beneath a bombed-out bakery, accessible through a hole in the wall that had been carefully concealed behind stacks of flour sacks. Amira crouched in the darkness, her medical bag clutched against her chest, listening to the sounds of the city above them as it went about the business of surviving another day. It had been 3 days since they had escaped through their apartment's back window, climbing down a fire escape that groaned under their weight while the voices in the hallway grew more insistent. 3 days of moving from hiding place to hiding place, sleeping in shifts and trying to piece together the puzzle of Amira's identity from fragments of memory and overheard conversations. "Tell me again about the day Mama brought you home," Khalil whispered. He sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, sharing a can of cold beans that their friend Marwan had smuggled to them from his family's dwindling supplies. Amira closed her eyes and tried to remember. She had done this exercise so many times in the past 72 hours that the memories had begun to feel worn smooth, like stones rubbed by countless hands. "I was 3 years old. Mama said she found me in the hospital after a bombing. She said my parents had been killed, and she couldn't bear to let me go to an orphanage." "But you remember things from before that, don't you?" Khalil pressed gently. "You always have. Things you shouldn't remember if you were only 3. She nodded slowly. The memories were there, floating just beneath the surface of her consciousness like fish in murky water. A woman with gentle hands teaching her to identify medicinal plants in a garden that smelled of jasmine and rosemary. The same woman showing her how to clean and bandage wounds using nothing but clean cloth and patience. A man's voice singing lullabies in a dialect she couldn't place. Songs about mountains and olive groves and the healing power of hope. "I remember a room with white walls and big windows," she said, the images becoming clearer as she spoke. There were beds lined up in rows, and people in white coats who moved very quietly. I remember thinking they walked like birds, stepping carefully so they wouldn't wake the sleeping people. A hospital? Maybe, or a clinic. She paused, focusing on a detail that had always puzzled her. I remember hiding under one of the beds because someone was looking for me. A man in a green uniform. I couldn't understand why everyone was so afraid of him, but I knew I was supposed to hide. Khalil was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Above them, they could hear the regular sounds of life continuing. Children playing in the rubble, women calling to each other from windows, the occasional rumble of vehicles passing on the street. But underneath it all was the tension that had become as much a part of Damascus as the ancient stones of its walls. "Amira," Khalil said finally, "what if the woman who taught you about medicine wasn't Mama? What if it was someone else, someone from before? The possibility had been haunting her since they had seen the photograph in the medical journal. Captain Yasmin Al-Rashid had been a field medic, skilled in trauma surgery and emergency care. Amira had always assumed her medical knowledge came from her volunteer work at the clinic, but the truth was that she had known things from the beginning: which herbs stopped bleeding, how to set a broken bone, how to recognize the signs of internal injury, knowledge that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training. "I think," she said slowly, "that Captain Yasmin Al-Rashid might have been my mother, my real mother." Khalil shifted closer to her in the darkness. "But that would mean she didn't die in 1987. That would mean someone wanted people to think she was dead." Amira pulled the medical journal from her bag and opened it to the photograph again. Even in the dim light filtering down from the street above, the resemblance was unmistakable. And it would mean that whoever killed her is still looking for something she had, something they think I might have inherited. The knowledge felt like a weight settling in her chest. For 23 years, she had lived as Amira Haddad, the adopted daughter of a kind woman who had saved her from the chaos of war. She had built her identity around small, concrete things: her love of reading, her skill with healing, her fierce protectiveness toward the people she cared about. But now all of that felt like a costume she had been wearing without knowing it. A sound from above made them both freeze, footsteps crossing the floor of the bakery, slow and deliberate. Someone was up there, moving through the ruins of the shop where Mr. Abu Khaled had made bread for 40 years before a mortar shell had ended both his business and his life. Khalil reached for the knife he kept in his belt, a short blade that had belonged to their father. Amira put a restraining hand on his arm and listened. The footsteps were accompanied by a soft, tapping sound, like someone using a walking stick or a cane. An old person, she thought, or someone injured. "Down here," a voice called softly in Arabic. "I know you're down there, child. I've been looking for you." The voice was female, elderly, and carried the particular warmth that comes from years of speaking to people with kindness. But, in their current situation, kindness could be as dangerous as cruelty. "Who are you?" Amira called back, not moving from her position. "My name is Dr. Soraya Mansouri. I worked with your mother at the field hospital in Deir-ez-Zor. I have something that belongs to you." Amira's heart began to race. The name meant nothing to her, but the mention of Deir-ez-Zor, the same town mentioned in the medical journal, was too specific to be a coincidence. She looked at Khalil, who nodded slightly. They had to take the risk. "Come down slowly," Amira called. "Keep your hands where we can see them." The woman who descended into their hiding place moved carefully, favoring her left leg and using a carved wooden cane for support. She appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that held the particular depth that comes from seeing too much of human suffering. She wore a long black coat despite the heat, and carried a leather satchel that looked as old as she was. "You look exactly like her," Dr. Mansouri said, settling herself on a crate with obvious relief. "Exactly like Yasmin when she was your age." "You knew my mother?" The words felt strange in Amira's mouth. "For 20 years, mother," had meant Lila Haddad, the woman who had raised her with patience and love, despite the hardships of their life. "I trained her in field surgery. She was the most gifted medic I ever worked with. She could diagnose internal bleeding by touch, could stabilize a patient with nothing but gauze and determination." Dr. Mansouri opened her satchel and pulled out a stack of photographs. "She saved my life twice, and the lives of more soldiers than we ever counted." The photographs showed a younger version of the woman in the medical journal, always in motion, always focused on her work. Yasmin Al-Rashid bent over a patient in a field tent, her hands steady as she worked. Yasmin laughing with a group of other medics, her smile bright despite the exhaustion visible in her eyes. Yasmin was holding a small child, a girl with dark hair and serious eyes who looked exactly like Amira had at that age. "That's you," Dr. Mansouri said gently, pointing to the last photograph. "You were 4 years old when that was taken. Your mother brought you to the hospital sometimes when she couldn't find anyone to watch you. You used to sit in the corner and organize the medical supplies by size." Amira stared at the photograph, and suddenly the memories came flooding back with painful clarity. The smell of antiseptic and clean bandages, the sound of her mother's voice explaining procedures in the patient, careful tone she used when teaching, the feeling of safety that came from being near her, even in the middle of chaos. What happened to her? Amira's voice was barely a whisper. Dr. Mansouri was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of 37 years of kept secrets. Your mother discovered something she wasn't supposed to know. We were treating soldiers from both sides of the conflict. Syrian, Iraqi, Iranian. It didn't matter to us. But Yasmin noticed patterns in the wounds, in the types of weapons being used. She realized that some of the casualties were being caused by a third party, someone who was playing all sides against each other. Who? A private military company. Foreign contractors who were being paid to prolong the conflict, to test new weapons and tactics. They needed the war to continue, so they made sure it did. Dr. Mansouri pulled out a small notebook from her satchel, its pages yellowed with age. Yasmin documented everything. Serial numbers from weapons fragments, photographs of unusual wound patterns, testimony from soldiers who had seen unmarked vehicles and unidentified aircraft. Khalil leaned forward. She was building a case against them. More than that, she was planning to expose them to the international media. She had contacts at the Red Cross, journalists who would have published her findings. Dr. Mansouri opened the notebook and showed them pages covered in Yasmin's careful handwriting, medical diagrams mixed with what looked like intelligence reports. The night before she was supposed to deliver the evidence, the Marksman unit found her. But she didn't die, Amira said, the pieces finally beginning to fit together. No, she was badly wounded, but I managed to get her out of the hospital before they came looking for her body. We faked her death, buried an empty coffin, and I helped her disappear. Dr. Mansouri's voice grew soft with memory. She spent 2 years in hiding, recovering from her injuries and planning her next move. But she knew they would never stop looking for her, and she knew they would eventually find you. So she gave me up. The words hurt more than Amira had expected them to. She gave you to Layla Haddad, her dearest friend, and the only person she trusted completely. Layla was a nurse who had worked with us at the hospital, and she had always wanted children but couldn't have them naturally. Your mother made her promise to raise you as her own, to never tell you the truth unless it became absolutely necessary. Amira felt tears running down her cheeks, though she hadn't realized she was crying. The woman she had called mother for 20 years had been keeping this secret, protecting her from a truth that was only now catching up with them. "Where is Yasmin now?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Dr. Mansouri reached into her satchel one more time and pulled out a letter, sealed with wax that had cracked with age. She died 3 years ago, in a small village near the Turkish border. Cancer, brought on by chemical exposure during the war. But before she died, she gave me this letter and made me promise to find you if the Marksman unit ever discovered your location. Amira took the letter with shaking hands. Her name was written on the outside in the same careful handwriting they had seen in the notebook. "Why now?" Khalil asked. "Why are they looking for her now after all these years?" "Because the evidence your mother gathered is valuable again. The same company that operated during the Iran-Iraq war is now active in Syria. They're using the same tactics, the same weapons, creating the same patterns of destruction. If someone could prove the connection, could show that this has been happening for decades." Dr. Mansouri gestured toward the ceiling, toward the sounds of the city struggling to survive above them. "It could change everything." Amira broke the wax seal and opened the letter. The paper was thick and cream-colored, and the ink had faded to brown, but the words were still clear. "My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then the shadows of the past have finally found you. I am sorry for the deception, sorry for the years we lost, sorry for the burden I am placing on your shoulders. But you are the only one who can finish what I started. The evidence is hidden in the place where we first met, where I taught you to identify medicinal plants in the garden that smelled of jasmine and rosemary. Trust, Dr. Mansouri. Trust your skills. Trust your heart. And remember that healing is not just about stopping bleeding. Sometimes it's about exposing the source of the wound. With all my love, Yasmin Al-Rashid." The garden. Amira could see it clearly now, not just fragments of memory, but the whole picture. A small courtyard behind the field hospital, where her mother had grown herbs for making medicine when proper supplies ran short. Mint for stomach ailments, chamomile for anxiety, rosemary for improving circulation. And somewhere in that garden, hidden for 37 years, was the evidence that could expose the people who had torn Syria apart. "I know where it is," she said. The journey back to Deir-ez-Zor took them 4 days of traveling at night, moving through a landscape that war had transformed into something unrecognizable. Dr. Mansouri had contacts throughout Syria, former colleagues from the medical corps, nurses who had worked in field hospitals, drivers who had ferried supplies through dangerous territory for decades. Each one took them a little farther, passing them along a network of people who remembered Yasmin Al-Rashid and were willing to risk their lives to help her daughter. Amira sat in the back of a supply truck as it bounced along a road that was more pothole than pavement, watching the countryside roll past through a gap in the canvas covering. The driver, a man named Hassan who had transported medical supplies during the Iran-Iraq War, told stories of the old days while Khalil dozed against her shoulder. "Your mother," Hassan said, glancing at them in his rearview mirror, "she once operated on a soldier for 6 hours straight while mortars were falling around the hospital. Never flinched, never stopped working. When it was over, she went outside and threw up from fear, but during the surgery her hands were steady as stone." The stories accumulated like layers of sediment, building a picture of Yasmin Al-Rashid that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. She had been brave, yes, but also young and frightened. She had saved lives while struggling to save her own. She had been brilliant and determined, but also human in her doubts and fears. They crossed through 3 checkpoints, each one a test of nerves and false documentation. Dr. Mansouri had procured papers identifying them as medical volunteers traveling to assist with refugee camps, and each time the soldiers examined their documents, Amira held her breath and tried to look like someone whose greatest concern was vaccinating children rather than exposing decades-old war crimes. At the 3rd checkpoint, near the outskirts of Deir-ez-Zor, they were stopped by soldiers who didn't wear the insignia of any official Syrian unit. Their uniforms were clean and well-maintained, their weapons modern and precisely maintained. The officer who examined their papers had pale eyes and spoke Arabic with a slight accent that Amira couldn't identify. "Medical volunteers," he said, reading their documents aloud. "Strange time to be traveling to Deir-ez-Zor. Most people are trying to leave." Dr. Mansouri leaned forward from the passenger seat, her voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being respected. "Illness doesn't wait for convenient timing, Captain. There are reports of cholera in the refugee camps east of the city." The officer handed back their papers, but his eyes lingered on Amira's face. "You look familiar, miss. Have we met before?" "I don't think so," Amira replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I work mostly in Damascus." "Damascus." The officer nodded slowly. "Interesting city. Full of history. Full of secrets." He stepped back and waved them through, but Amira could feel his eyes on them as their truck pulled away. "He knew," Khalil whispered once they were out of earshot. "Maybe," Dr. Mansouri replied, "or maybe he was fishing. Either way, we need to move quickly once we reach the city." Deir-ez-Zor had changed beyond recognition since Amira's childhood memories. The field hospital where her mother had worked was gone, replaced by a refugee camp that stretched for miles in every direction. Tents and makeshift shelters covered what had once been agricultural land, and the air was thick with dust and the smoke from countless cooking fires. But the garden, the small courtyard where Yasmin had taught her daughter to identify healing plants, was still there, hidden behind the ruins of what had once been the hospital's administrative building. Nature had reclaimed it over the decades, and the medicinal herbs had grown wild, spreading into a tangle of green that was barely contained by the old stone walls. "She always said plants remember," Dr. Mansouri murmured as they stood at the entrance to the garden. "Even when buildings fall and people die, the plants remember." Amira stepped into the space where her earliest memories had been formed, and suddenly she was 4 years old again, following her mother as she moved between the rows of plants, learning to distinguish between chamomile and feverfew by the shape of their leaves, understanding that rosemary was good for memory and that mint could settle an upset stomach. The jasmine bush was still there, enormous now, its white flowers filling the air with a scent that transported her instantly back to those afternoons when the world had seemed safe and her mother had seemed invincible. She knelt beside it and began to dig, her hands guided by memory rather than conscious thought. "Here," she said, and her fingers found something hard buried in the rich soil. The metal box was small, about the size of a book, and sealed with wax to keep out moisture. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were the documents that Yasmin Al-Rashid had died to protect, photographs of weapon fragments, serial numbers traced to specific manufacturers, financial records showing payments to mercenary units, and testimony from soldiers who had witnessed unmarked aircraft dropping experimental munitions. But the most damning evidence was a thick folder of correspondence between officials in Damascus, Tehran, and Baghdad, and representatives of a company called Strategic Defense Solutions. The letters, dating from 1985 to 1987, detailed a systematic plan to prolong the Iran-Iraq war by supplying weapons to all sides while testing new military technologies on civilian populations. They were using the war as a laboratory, Dr. Mansouri said, reading over Amira's shoulder, testing chemical weapons, experimental ammunition, new targeting systems. Every battle was a field test. Khalil pulled out a photograph that showed a group of men in business suits standing beside military officers. In the background, barely visible, was the distinctive minaret of a mosque in Damascus. This was taken in Syria. They were coordinating with people in our own government. Amira studied the faces in the photograph, trying to memorize their features. These were the men who had profited from decades of suffering, who had turned human pain into profit margins and statistical analyses. One face in particular caught her attention, a young man with pale eyes who bore a striking resemblance to the officer who had stopped them at the checkpoint. "Dr. Mansouri," she said slowly, "I think we were followed." The sound of vehicles approaching confirmed her fears. Through the gaps in the garden wall, they could see military trucks surrounding the hospital ruins, and soldiers taking positions with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times before. "How many ways out of here?" Khalil asked, but even as he spoke, they could see that all the exits were being covered. Dr. Mansouri was already stuffing the documents back into their container. "There's a drainage tunnel that leads to the river. It was built during the original hospital construction for waste management. Your mother and I used it once before, when we needed to move patients during a bombing." "Where?" Amira demanded. "Behind the mint plants, near the back wall. But it's been 30 years. I don't know if it's still passable." They could hear voices now, orders being given in Arabic and another language that sounded like English. The search was methodical, moving through the ruins systematically. It would only be a matter of minutes before they reached the garden. Amira crawled to the back wall and found the entrance to the tunnel, mostly hidden by overgrown vegetation. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and it disappeared into darkness that smelled of stagnant water and decay. "I'll go first," she said, clutching the metal box against her chest. "No," Khalil protested. "Let me." "This is my responsibility," Amira interrupted. "My mother died for this information. I won't let it die with me." She lowered herself into the tunnel, her feet finding purchase on stones that were slick with moisture. The space was claustrophobic, forcing her to move in a crouch, and the air was thick, with the smell of rotting vegetation and something else, something that reminded her of the chemical odor that sometimes drifted over Damascus after particularly intense bombing campaigns. Behind her, she could hear Dr. Mansouri and Khalil following, their movements echoing in the confined space. And from above, growing closer, came the sounds of the search. Boots on stone, voices calling instructions, the metallic click of weapons being readied. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, and Amira began to worry that it had collapsed somewhere ahead, that they were crawling toward a dead end that would trap them underground while their pursuers closed in from above. But gradually, she began to see light ahead, not the harsh glare of electric illumination, but the softer glow of daylight filtering through an opening. She emerged from the tunnel into a drainage ditch beside the Euphrates River, gasping with relief at the fresh air and open sky. The water was brown with silt and moved sluggishly between banks lined with reeds and trash, but it was beautiful to her at that moment. It was freedom. Dr. Mansouri and Khalil climbed out behind her, both of them muddy and exhausted but alive. From their position, they could see the hospital ruins across a stretch of scrubland, and the soldiers moving through the area they had vacated just minutes before. "We need to get this information to someone who can use it," Amira said, holding up the metal box. "Someone with the resources to investigate, to publish it, to make sure the world knows what really happened." "I know someone," Dr. Mansouri said, pulling a waterproof phone from her coat pocket. A journalist in Istanbul. She's been investigating Syrian war crimes for years, but she's never had documentation this comprehensive. As they made their way along the riverbank, staying low and moving carefully through the reeds, Amira couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. The sensation prickled at the back of her neck, the same instinct that had made her drop her book just before the bullets tore through her bedroom wall. She was right to be worried. 3 days later, as they sat in a safe house in Aleppo waiting for transportation to the Turkish border, the television news carried a story that made her blood run cold. The reporter, speaking in crisp BBC English, stood in front of the ruins of a building in Damascus, a building Amira recognized as the clinic where she had volunteered. A gas leak explosion killed 12 people yesterday evening, including several medical volunteers who were treating wounded civilians, the reporter said. Among the dead was Dr. Farid Khalil, who had been working with international aid organizations to provide medical care in the besieged areas of the capital. Dr. Khalil, the elderly physician who had taught Amira advanced trauma surgery, who had shared his precious medical supplies with anyone who needed them, who had never asked questions about why she seemed to know procedures she shouldn't have learned yet. He was dead, along with 11 other people whose only crime had been trying to heal the wounded. "They're killing everyone who might have information," Khalil whispered, his face pale with shock. Dr. Mansouri turned off the television with a sharp click. "Or everyone who might help you. They're trying to isolate you, to cut off your support network." The pattern continued over the following weeks as they made their slow, dangerous journey toward the Turkish border. Hassan, the truck driver who had transported them to Deir-ez-Zor, was found dead in his vehicle, officially the victim of a roadside bombing, but with wounds that Dr. Mansouri quietly identified as consistent with close-range execution. The nurse who had provided them with false documentation disappeared from her home in Latakia, leaving behind only signs of a struggle and neighbors too frightened to speak to investigators. Each death felt like a personal blow, but they also served to confirm the importance of what they carried. The people hunting them weren't taking these elaborate precautions to recover some minor piece of historical curiosity. The evidence in the metal box was dangerous enough to justify murder on a systematic scale. They traveled mostly at night, moving through a network of safe houses maintained by people who had learned to operate in the shadows of the war. In a bombed-out school in Idlib, they met a former Syrian army intelligence officer named Colonel Rashid, who examined their documents with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. "Strategic defense solutions," he said, reading through the correspondence. "I remember hearing whispers about them during my active service. They were ghosts. Everyone knew they existed, but no one could prove it. They had contracts with governments, but also with rebel groups, with foreign militaries, with anyone who needed specialized services." "What kind of services?" Amira asked. "Deniable operations, weapons testing, information warfare. They would take contracts to destabilize regions, to prolong conflicts, to test new technologies under combat conditions." Colonel Rashid pointed to a financial document that showed payments in the millions of dollars. "Look at this. They were being paid by 3 different governments simultaneously to influence the outcome of the Iran-Iraq war, but they weren't trying to help any one side win. They were being paid to keep the war going. For 8 years, Dr. Mansouri added quietly, 8 years of testing chemical weapons on Kurdish villages, of refining targeting systems on civilian infrastructure, of using an entire region as a laboratory for military innovation." Colonel Rashid closed the folder and looked directly at Amira. "And now they're doing the same thing in Syria. The patterns are identical. Multiple funding sources, experimental weapons, systematic targeting of medical facilities and schools. They're using our civil war to test the next generation of warfare technologies." The weight of this knowledge settled on Amira's shoulders like a physical burden. Her mother had died trying to expose these people 37 years ago, and now the same company was using Syria as their testing ground, refining techniques for urban warfare and population control that would eventually be exported around the world. "There's something else," Colonel Rashid said, pulling out a laptop computer. "I've been tracking unusual activity in military communications over the past few weeks. Someone has been coordinating search operations across multiple provinces, using resources from different branches of the security services, but operating outside official command structures." He showed them intercepts of coded radio transmissions, logistics reports for helicopter flights that didn't appear on any official manifests, and requisition orders for specialized surveillance equipment. The scope of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of personnel, millions of dollars in resources, all focused on finding one young woman and the evidence she carried. "They're treating this like a major counterintelligence operation," Colonel Rashid continued. "The level of resources they're committing suggests that what you have could genuinely threaten their entire business model." That night, as they prepared to make the final push toward the Turkish border, Amira sat alone in the ruins of what had once been a classroom, looking through her mother's documents by the light of a small oil lamp. Children's artwork still decorated the walls, crayon drawings of houses and families and trees, created by students who had probably fled or died when the war reached their neighborhood. The contrast between the innocent drawings and the systematic documentation of atrocities was almost unbearable. Here were children's visions of home and safety, and here were the financial records of the people who had made such dreams impossible for millions of families. She came across a document she hadn't noticed before, filed behind the financial records. It was a list of names, Syrian officials who had been in contact with strategic defense solutions during the 1980s. Many of the names meant nothing to her, but one made her hands tremble with recognition. General Ahmad Haddad, the man whose last name she had carried for 20 years. The man she had believed to be her adoptive grandfather, the father of the woman who had raised her with such love and care. Dr. Mansouri found her there an hour later, still staring at the document in shock. "What is it, child?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "My adoptive family," Amira whispered. "They weren't random people who happened to help me. General Haddad was one of the Syrian officials who worked with strategic defense solutions. He was part of the network my mother was trying to expose." The implications crashed over her like a wave. Layla Haddad hadn't found Amira by chance at a hospital after a bombing. She had been chosen specifically, selected to raise the daughter of the woman who had threatened to expose her father's involvement in war crimes. "They were watching me my whole life," Amira said, her voice hollow with realization. "Every birthday, every school performance, every moment of happiness, they were keeping track of Yasmin Al-Rashid's daughter, making sure I never learned the truth about who I was or what my mother had discovered." Dr. Mansouri sat beside her among the ruins, her elderly hands gentle as she took Amira's arm. "Perhaps, or perhaps Layla Haddad truly loved you and chose to protect you despite her family's connections. People are complicated, child. Good people sometimes come from bad families, and bad people sometimes raise children with genuine love." But the revelation cast everything in a different light. 20 years of kindness and care, viewed through the lens of systematic deception. Had Layla's love been real, or had it been performance? Had she known about her father's involvement with the mercenary company, or had she been an innocent pawn used to keep Yasmin's daughter under observation? The questions gnawed at her as they made their final approach to the Turkish border, traveling in a refugee convoy that Colonel Rashid had arranged. She sat in the back of a truck, filled with families fleeing the war, children sleeping against their mothers' shoulders, elderly men clutching photographs of homes they would never see again. These were the real victims of the experiments documented in her metal box. Not statistics in a report or test subjects for weapons development, but human beings whose lives had been torn apart by conflicts that were being deliberately prolonged for profit. Every child in the truck, every grieving mother, every displaced family was a casualty of the system her mother had died trying to expose. As they approached the border crossing, Amira could see Turkish military positions on the hillsides, their searchlights sweeping the approaches to the fence. But she could also see something else. Vehicles that didn't belong to the Turkish border guards, positioned in locations that would give them clear fields of fire across the crossing points. "They're here," Khalil said quietly, following her gaze. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Strategic defense solutions had resources in Turkey as well as Syria, and they had positioned themselves to intercept any attempt to cross the border with sensitive information. The Turkish authorities might not even know about the operation. Private military contractors were skilled at operating in the gray areas between official jurisdictions. "We can't cross here," Dr. Mansouri said, reaching the same conclusion. "Then where?" Amira asked. Colonel Rashid, who had been monitoring radio communications, looked up from his equipment with grim determination. There's a journalist in Gaziantep, just across the border. Maya Osman, she's Turkish Syrian, speaks both languages, and she's been investigating Syrian war crimes for the International Criminal Court. If we can get the documents to her, she has the resources and connections to make them public. But how do we reach her if they're watching the border? We don't cross the border, Colonel Rashid replied. We bring the border to us. The plan that Colonel Rashid outlined was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. Rather than attempting to cross the heavily monitored border, they would use an old smuggling tunnel that ran beneath the crossing point, emerging on the Turkish side in the basement of a building that had been used by refugees and resistance fighters for decades. But more importantly, they would transmit digital copies of all the documents to multiple journalists and human rights organizations simultaneously, ensuring that even if they were captured, the evidence would still reach the public. Insurance, Colonel Rashid called it, as he photographed each page with a high-resolution camera. Even if Strategic Defense Solutions eliminates us, they can't eliminate the truth once it's been distributed to enough people. They spent 2 days in an abandoned warehouse near the border, digitizing every document, every photograph, every piece of correspondence that Yasmin Al-Rashid had collected 37 years earlier. Dr. Mansouri provided context for the medical evidence, explaining how the wound patterns and chemical exposure data proved the systematic testing of experimental weapons on civilian populations. Khalil proved surprisingly adept at the technical aspects of their operation, using his knowledge of computers and networks to encrypt the files and establish secure communication channels with journalists in Turkey, Europe, and the United States. Watching him work, Amira was struck by how much he had changed over the past few weeks. The boy who had worried about university exams and football matches had become someone who could coordinate international intelligence operations while remaining calm under pressure. Your brother has his father's courage, Dr. Mansouri observed as Khalil troubleshot a problem with their satellite uplink. He's not really my brother, Amira replied automatically, then stopped herself. The revelation about her true parentage had made her question all her relationships. But looking at Khalil as he worked to help her expose the truth, she realized that blood connections were less important than the bonds forged by shared struggle and mutual care. He had chosen to follow her into danger, chosen to risk his life for a cause that wasn't originally his own. That made him more of a brother than any accident of birth could. On the third night, as they prepared to make their crossing attempt, Colonel Rashid received intelligence that changed everything. His contacts in Syrian military communications had intercepted orders for a massive search operation, involving not just Syrian forces but also Turkish border guards and what appeared to be personnel from a private security company. They know we're here, he said, showing them the transcripts. Someone leaked our location, probably through the refugee convoy. They're setting up a cordon around the entire border area, a net with a 20-kilometer radius. Amira felt the familiar chill of being hunted, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a growing anger that burned steady and bright in her chest. These people had killed her mother, had murdered dozens of innocent doctors and nurses, had turned entire regions into testing grounds for weapons of mass destruction. And now they were mobilizing armies to stop one young woman from telling the truth about their crimes. Good, she said, surprising everyone, including herself, with the firmness in her voice. Let them come. Let them show the world exactly how much they fear the truth. Amira, Dr. Mansouri said gently, we need to be practical. If they capture us, they won't capture us. Amira stood and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of the Turkish border posts in the distance. Because we're not going to run anymore. We're going to make them come to us, and when they do, we're going to make sure every journalist in the region is watching. The idea that formed in her mind was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it had the elegance of turning their enemies' strengths against them. Strategic Defense Solutions relied on operating in shadows, on conducting their business away from public scrutiny. What if, instead of hiding from them, Amira forced them into the light? We're going to call a press conference, she announced. Khalil looked up from his computer screen. A what? A press conference, tomorrow morning at the border crossing. We'll invite every journalist within 100 kilometers. Tell them we have evidence of war crimes dating back decades. And when Strategic Defense Solutions shows up to stop us, they'll be doing it in front of cameras from around the world. Colonel Rashid stared at her for a long moment, then began to smile. It's completely insane. It violates every principle of operational security. It's the last thing they would expect. He paused. It might actually work. The next 12 hours were a blur of activity. Khalil sent encrypted messages to journalists throughout Turkey and Syria, promising evidence of systematic war crimes that would, quote, redefine understanding of the Syrian conflict. Dr. Mansouri used her medical contacts to alert international human rights organizations. Colonel Rashid coordinated with his intelligence network to ensure that multiple copies of their evidence were already in the hands of people who could act on it. By dawn, the response was overwhelming. Reporters from the BBC, Al Jazeera, Reuters, and a dozen other organizations were en route to the border crossing. Representatives from Human Rights Watch, Médecins Sans Frontières, and the International Committee of the Red Cross had confirmed their attendance. The Turkish government, initially hesitant to allow such a gathering near their border, had been persuaded by the international attention to provide a neutral venue for the press conference. As the sun rose over the hills between Syria and Turkey, Amira stood before a crowd of more than 100 journalists, aid workers, and human rights observers. Behind her, projected on a large screen, was the photograph of Captain Yasmin Al-Rashid from the medical journal, the photograph that had started her journey toward understanding her true identity. "My name is Amira Al-Rashid," she began, using her mother's surname for the first time in public. "I am the daughter of Captain Yasmin Al-Rashid, a Syrian army medic who was murdered in 1987 for trying to expose war crimes. Today, I want to finish the work she died trying to complete." The documents she presented painted a picture of systematic atrocity that spanned decades. Financial records showing payments to mercenary units for testing operations on civilian populations. Medical evidence documenting the effects of experimental chemical weapons on Kurdish villages. Communications between Syrian officials and strategic defense solutions coordinators discussing the quote, optimal duration for regional conflicts to maximize weapons testing opportunities. But the most damning evidence was a series of recently intercepted communications showing that the same patterns were being repeated in Syria's current civil war. The same company, now operating under various subsidiary names, was providing weapons and tactical support to multiple factions simultaneously, ensuring that the conflict continued long enough for comprehensive testing of new military technologies. "They're not trying to end wars," Amira explained to the assembled reporters. "They're trying to perfect them. Every bombing of a hospital, every attack on a school, every use of chemical weapons against civilians, it's all data for them. We're not just casualties of war, we're test subjects for the next generation of warfare." The reaction was immediate and intense. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and satellite trucks began transmitting live coverage around the world. But Amira was watching the hills around the border crossing, waiting for the response she knew would come. She didn't have to wait long. Military vehicles began appearing on the ridge lines, not the usual border patrol units, but unmarked trucks and helicopters that moved with the precision of a special operations force. Through binoculars provided by one of the journalists, she could see figures in tactical gear taking positions around the press conference site. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd, "I believe we're about to have a demonstration of exactly how far strategic defense solutions will go to suppress evidence of their crimes." The attack, when it came, was swift and professionally executed. Smoke grenades created confusion among the crowd while armed figures moved in from multiple directions. But the assault was being broadcast live to millions of viewers around the world, and every violent action was being recorded by dozens of cameras. Amira found herself surrounded by a protective circle of journalists and human rights workers, all of them recognizing that she was the primary target of the operation. Dr. Mansouri stayed close beside her, one arm around her shoulders, while Khalil worked frantically to ensure that their digital evidence was being transmitted even as the physical confrontation unfolded around them. Amira Al-Rashid, a voice called through a bullhorn speaking in English with the same accent she had heard at the checkpoint in Deir-ez-Zor. "You are carrying stolen classified materials. Surrender them immediately and no one will be harmed." She stepped forward, still protected by the crowd but visible to the cameras. "My name is Amira Al-Rashid, daughter of Captain Yasmin Al-Rashid, who was murdered by Strategic Defense Solutions in 1987 for trying to expose their war crimes. The materials I carry are not stolen. They are evidence of systematic atrocities committed against civilian populations over a period of nearly 4 decades. The standoff lasted for almost an hour, broadcast live around the world as diplomatic negotiations took place at the highest levels of government. The Turkish authorities, faced with an international incident playing out on live television, demanded that the armed figures identify themselves and explain their presence on Turkish soil. The Syrian government, caught between multiple conflicting interests, issued contradictory statements claiming both full support for and complete ignorance of the operation. In the end, it was international pressure that resolved the immediate crisis. Faced with global media attention and diplomatic protests from dozens of countries, Strategic Defense Solutions was forced to withdraw their personnel without achieving their objective. But Amira knew that this was only the beginning of a much longer struggle. The evidence she had presented sparked investigations in multiple countries. The International Criminal Court announced that it was opening a formal inquiry into war crimes in Syria, using the documents as the foundation for their case. Several European governments launched their own investigations into Strategic Defense Solutions and its network of subsidiary companies. The United Nations Security Council called emergency sessions to address what the Secretary-General called a systematic pattern of crimes against humanity spanning multiple decades. But perhaps the most important revelation came 3 days after the press conference, when Layla Haddad, the woman who had raised Amira as her own daughter, came forward with her own testimony. "I have been silent for 20 years, she said in a video statement recorded in her home in Latakia, her face showing the wear of decades of carrying secrets. But seeing my daughter's courage, I can no longer hide the truth about my family's involvement in these crimes." She confirmed that her father, General Ahmad Haddad, had been one of the Syrian officials who had collaborated with Strategic Defense Solutions during the 1980s. But she also revealed something that the documents had not shown, that she had been working as an informant for Syrian military intelligence when she was asked to take custody of Yasmin Al-Rashid's daughter. "They told me to watch her, to report on her activities and associations. They wanted to make sure she never learned about her mother or the evidence that had been hidden. But from the moment I held her in my arms, she became my daughter in every way that mattered. I chose to protect her instead of betraying her, even though I knew it put my own life at risk." The revelation cast Amira's entire childhood in a new light, but not in the way she had feared. Layla Haddad had been placed in an impossible position, forced to choose between loyalty to her family and protection of an innocent child. She had chosen love over duty, truth over convenience, and she had spent 20 years walking a careful line between keeping Amira safe and keeping her uninformed. "She saved me twice," Amira said in an interview with the BBC 2 weeks after the press conference. "Once when she took me from the hospital as a child, and again when she chose to love me despite the circumstances that brought us together. Family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about the choices people make to care for each other." The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Strategic Defense Solutions operations. The company had contracts with governments and rebel groups in 17 countries, had tested chemical weapons on civilian populations in at least 6 regions, and had deliberately prolonged conflicts in order to create optimal conditions for weapons testing and tactical development. But more importantly, the investigation revealed a pattern of cover-ups and official complicity that reached the highest levels of government in multiple countries. Syrian officials had provided civilian targets for weapons testing. Turkish authorities had allowed the transportation of experimental munitions across their borders. European governments had provided diplomatic cover for operations that violated international law. The scandal that emerged from Amira's press conference ultimately led to the collapse of Strategic Defense Solutions as a corporate entity, though many of its personnel and resources were simply transferred to other companies with different names. More significantly, it sparked a broader conversation about the role of private military contractors in contemporary warfare and the need for international oversight of weapons testing and development. 6 months after the press conference that changed everything, Amira stood in the rebuilt courtyard of what had once been her mother's field hospital in Deir-ez-Zor. The garden where she had recovered the hidden documents was now part of a memorial park dedicated to the victims of chemical weapons testing, and the jasmine bush where she had first learned to identify healing plants had become a pilgrimage site for families seeking to honor their lost loved ones. The International Criminal Court had issued indictments against 37 individuals connected to Strategic Defense Solutions, including the pale-eyed officer who had stopped them at the checkpoint and several high-ranking Syrian officials who had facilitated the weapons testing programs. Extradition proceedings were underway in multiple countries, And while some of the accused would likely never face justice, the legal framework for prosecuting such crimes had been fundamentally strengthened. But for Amira, the most meaningful changes were happening at a more personal level. The underground clinic, where she had volunteered in Damascus, had been rebuilt with international funding, and she now served as its director of trauma surgery. The medical knowledge that had seemed to come from inherited memory had been formalized through accelerated training programs, and she had become one of Syria's most skilled battlefield surgeons. "Your hands," Dr. Mansouri said, watching Amira work on a patient who had been injured in a car bombing, "they move exactly like your mother's did. The same confidence, the same precision. It's as if she's working through you." The connection to her mother had deepened as more people came forward with stories about Captain Yasmin Al-Rashid. Former colleagues shared memories of her skill and compassion. Patients she had treated tracked down Amira to express their gratitude and to tell her how much her mother's care had meant to them. A picture emerged of a woman who had been not just a skilled medic, but a person of extraordinary courage and integrity. Khalil had chosen to remain in Syria despite offers of scholarships to universities in Europe and America. He worked as a coordinator for international aid organizations, using his technical skills to establish communication networks for refugee camps, and his language abilities to facilitate cooperation between Syrian and international medical teams. "Someone needs to help rebuild," he said when asked about his decision to stay. "And besides, this is our home. The people who tried to destroy it don't get to drive us away." The relationship between Amira and Layla Haddad had required careful rebuilding after the revelations about their family's connections to strategic defense solutions. But the process of reconciliation had ultimately strengthened their bond rather than weakening it. "I understand now why you never told me stories about your family," Amira said during one of their regular phone conversations. "You were protecting me from knowledge that could have gotten me killed." "But I was also protecting myself," Layla replied with characteristic honesty. "I was afraid that if you knew the truth about my father, you would hate me for being his daughter. I chose silence because it felt safer, even though I knew it wasn't fair to you." The conversation had taken place during Amira's first visit to Latakia since the press conference, and it had been accompanied by the ritual of going through family photographs and documents that Layla had kept hidden for decades. There were pictures of General Ahmad Haddad in his military uniform, correspondence about his involvement with strategic defense solutions, and financial records showing payments that had funded the comfortable life his family had enjoyed during the 1980s. But there were also documents that told a different story. Evidence that Layla had been secretly sending money to support families affected by chemical weapons attacks, medical supplies purchased with her own savings, and delivered anonymously to hospitals treating victims of experimental weapons. She had been trying to atone for her father's crimes while simultaneously fulfilling her role as Amira's protector. "Guilt," she explained, "is a terrible counselor. It made me think that keeping secrets was the same thing as keeping you safe. But watching you stand up in front of those cameras, telling the truth despite knowing how dangerous it was, that taught me that safety without honesty is just another form of prison." The memorial park in Deir-ez-Zor had become a focal point for healing that extended far beyond the immediate community. Families traveled from across Syria and neighboring countries to visit the site, where evidence of systematic war crimes had been hidden for 37 years before finally being brought to light. The garden where Yasmin Al-Rashid had taught her daughter to identify medicinal plants had been expanded into a teaching facility where traditional healing methods were preserved and shared alongside modern medical techniques. Dr. Mansouri, despite her advanced age, had taken on the role of director for the memorial's educational programs. She conducted tours for visiting medical students, taught classes on field surgery techniques, and maintained a growing archive of testimonies from survivors of chemical weapons attacks. "Memory," she told her students, "is not just about preserving the past, it's about ensuring that the lessons of the past inform the decisions of the future. When we remember how easily medical knowledge can be perverted into weapons development, we become more vigilant about protecting the ethical foundations of our profession." The international investigation sparked by Amira's revelations had led to significant reforms in the regulation of private military contractors. The United Nations had established a new oversight body with the authority to investigate reports of weapons testing on civilian populations. Several European countries had passed laws making it illegal for their citizens to participate in such activities, regardless of where they took place. But perhaps more importantly, The investigation had revealed the extent to which ordinary people had been complicit in or willfully blind to systematic atrocities. Syrian doctors who had treated chemical weapons victims without reporting the unusual nature of their injuries. Turkish border guards who had allowed suspicious shipments to pass without inspection. European manufacturers who had produced specialized equipment without asking questions about its intended use. The recognition of this widespread complicity had led to a broader conversation about individual responsibility in the face of institutional wrongdoing. Medical schools began teaching courses on professional ethics that used the strategic defense solutions case as an example of how easily noble professions could be corrupted. Military academies incorporated discussions of the case into their training on the laws of war and the importance of refusing illegal orders. For Amira personally, the most difficult aspect of the aftermath had been learning to live with the knowledge of how much suffering could have been prevented if her mother's evidence had been taken seriously 37 years earlier. The chemical weapons attacks on Kurdish villages, the prolongation of the Iran-Iraq war, the testing of experimental munitions on civilian populations, all of it could have been stopped if the right people had listened to Captain Yasmin Al-Rashid's warnings. Survivor's guilt, Dr. Mansouri diagnosed during one of their regular conversations. You feel responsible for suffering you had no power to prevent. But I could have found the evidence sooner, Amira protested. I could have asked more questions about my family, could have investigated the gaps in my memory. You were 3 years old when your mother was forced to give you up, Dr. Mansouri replied gently. You were a child being protected by adults who loved you. The responsibility for those crimes lies with the people who committed them, not with the child who survived them. The therapeutic process of working through these feelings had been aided by her medical work. Every life she saved in the rebuilt clinic felt like a small act of redemption, a way of honoring her mother's memory while contributing to the healing of her country. The skills that had seemed to come from inherited memory were being used to train a new generation of Syrian medics, ensuring that the knowledge would survive even if the conflicts that had made it necessary eventually ended. May Aslam, 1 year after the press conference, Amira received a letter that had been forwarded through multiple international aid organizations before reaching her. The return address showed only a refugee camp in Jordan, and the envelope was worn from handling. Inside was a single photograph and a note written in Arabic by someone whose handwriting suggested limited literacy. The photograph showed a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, standing beside a tent in what was clearly a refugee camp. She was holding a small plant, a sprig of rosemary, and smiling despite the difficult circumstances visible in the background. The note read, Dear Dr. Amira, my name is Fatima, and I am from Aleppo. My grandmother saw you on television talking about your mother who was a doctor and who saved many people. My grandmother says you look like someone who remembers how to help people grow strong even in bad places. I am learning to be a doctor too. I practice on my dolls and I grow medicine plants like my grandmother taught me. Someday I want to help people like you and your mother did. Thank you for being brave. From your friend, Fatima. The letter represented something that no amount of legal proceedings or institutional reform could achieve. The inspiration for ordinary people to choose healing over hatred, hope over despair, truth over convenient silence. Fatima and thousands of children like her were growing up in refugee camps and war zones, but they were also growing up with the knowledge that individual courage could make a difference, that secrets eventually came to light, and that the work of healing was always worth the risk. 2 years after the press conference, Amira stood once again in the memorial garden in Deir-ez-Zor, but this time she was not alone. Representatives from medical schools across the Middle East had gathered for the first annual symposium on medical ethics in conflict zones, and the audience included students, practicing physicians, aid workers, and government officials responsible for medical policy. Her keynote address focused on the responsibility of medical professionals to speak out against the militarization of their knowledge and skills, but she concluded with something more personal, a reading from her mother's journal discovered among the documents they had recovered from the garden. Oh, I became a doctor to heal, she read from Yasmin Al-Rashid's careful handwriting, but I have learned that sometimes healing requires more than treating individual patients. Sometimes it requires treating the systems that create the injuries, the policies that perpetuate the suffering, the silence that enables the crimes. A surgeon who removes a bullet but ignores the gun is only doing half her job. The words resonated with the audience not just because of their historical significance, but because they spoke to contemporary challenges. Syria's civil war was winding down, but other conflicts around the world continued to provide opportunities for weapons testing and tactical experimentation. Private military contractors continued to operate in gray areas of international law. The fundamental problems that had enabled strategic defense solutions to commit decades of atrocities had not been fully resolved. But change was happening, slowly and sometimes imperceptibly, in the choices made by individuals who had learned from Yasmin and Amira Al-Rashid's example. Medical students who chose to specialize in trauma surgery despite the risks. Journalists who investigated military contractors despite pressure from powerful interests. Ordinary citizens who chose to speak out about wrongdoing they witnessed rather than maintaining comfortable silence. 3 years later, the knock on Amira's office door at the rebuilt medical facility came just as she was finishing her morning rounds. Through the window she could see the first light of dawn touching the minaret of the mosque that had somehow survived all the bombing, its call to prayer mixing with the sounds of a city slowly learning to live without the constant fear of attack. "Come in," she called, not looking up from the patient charts she was reviewing. The door opened to admit a young woman who moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to navigate the world despite significant physical challenges. She walked with crutches, her left leg clearly prosthetic below the knee, but her eyes held the determined brightness that Amira had learned to recognize in people who had survived terrible things and chosen to use their survival for something meaningful. "Dr. Al-Rashid, my name is Fatima Karim. I wrote to you 3 years ago from a refugee camp in Jordan." Amira looked up sharply, recognizing the name immediately. The little girl who had sent her a photograph of herself holding a sprig of rosemary had grown into a poised young woman of perhaps 18, wearing the white coat of a medical student and carrying herself with quiet confidence. "Fatima," Amira said, rising from behind her desk with a smile that felt like sunlight, "I remember your letter. You said you wanted to be a doctor." "I am a doctor," Fatima replied, setting down a worn leather bag that looked remarkably similar to the one Amira carried. "Well, nearly. I'm in my final year of medical school at the American University of Beirut. I'm here to complete my residency in trauma surgery, if you'll have me." The conversation that followed lasted well into the afternoon, as Fatima shared her journey from refugee camp to medical school, and Amira found herself looking at a reflection of her own determination, filtered through different experiences but the same fundamental commitment to healing. "After I saw your press conference," Fatima explained, "I knew that medicine could be more than just treating individual patients. It could be about exposing truth, about fighting the systems that create the injuries in the first place. Your mother's story showed me that a doctor's responsibility doesn't end at the hospital walls." Fatima had lost her leg in a chemical weapons attack on her neighborhood in eastern Aleppo when she was 14. But rather than allowing the injury to define her limitations, she had used it as motivation to understand the medical and political factors that had made such attacks possible. Her medical school thesis had focused on the long-term health effects of experimental chemical weapons, building on the foundation of evidence that Amira had brought to light. "I've been following the trials," Fatima said, referring to the ongoing international criminal proceedings against former Strategic Defense Solutions personnel. 7 convictions so far, with more cases pending. It's not enough to bring back the people we lost, but it's something." "It's a beginning," Amira agreed. "But the real victory isn't in the courtrooms. It's in the fact that young doctors like you are choosing to carry on the work of healing despite everything you've experienced." Over the following months, as Fatima settled into her residency training, Amira found herself thinking often about the cycles of trauma and healing that defined not just individual lives but entire societies. Syria was slowly emerging from its civil war, but the scars ran deep. Entire generations had grown up knowing only conflict, and the work of rebuilding would require more than just physical reconstruction. The medical facility had become a training center, not just for surgical techniques, but for what Dr. Mansouri had termed healing the healers, recognizing that doctors and nurses who had worked under wartime conditions carried their own psychological wounds that needed attention. Amira had instituted regular debriefing sessions where medical staff could process the traumatic cases they treated, and she had seen how this support enabled them to continue their work more effectively. Trauma, she told a gathering of international medical students who had come to study their methods, is not just individual, it's collective, generational, systemic. When we treat a patient's physical wounds without addressing the social conditions that created those wounds, were only providing temporary relief. True healing requires us to work at multiple levels simultaneously. The memorial garden in Deir-ez-Zor had expanded beyond its original role as a site of remembrance to become a living laboratory for sustainable healing practices. Traditional Syrian medicinal plants grew alongside modern pharmaceutical crops, and the facility produced both herbal remedies and conventional medications for distribution throughout the region. The integration of ancient and contemporary knowledge had proven remarkably effective, particularly for treating the complex psychological and physical symptoms associated with chemical weapons exposure. Dr. Mansouri, now in her 80s but still sharp and determined, had become the facility's chief ethnobotanist, working with traditional healers from across the Middle East to document and preserve medicinal knowledge that had been passed down through generations. Her work had taken on particular urgency, as many of the elderly practitioners had been displaced or killed during the various conflicts, taking their knowledge with them. "Plants remember," she would tell the students who worked with her in the garden. "Even when everything else is destroyed, the plants remember how to heal. Our job is to remember alongside them, to preserve the knowledge and pass it on to the next generation." The international investigation into strategic defense solutions had continued to expand, revealing connections to similar operations in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. The Syrian case had provided the legal precedent and evidentiary framework for prosecuting what international law was beginning to recognize as systematic warfare crimes, the deliberate use of civilian populations as testing subjects for military technologies. But the most significant long-term impact had been the establishment of the Al-Rashid Foundation, an international organization dedicated to protecting medical personnel and facilities in conflict zones. Funded by settlements from the Strategic Defense Solutions trials and donations from governments and private individuals around the world, the foundation provided security training, legal protection, and emergency relocation services for medical workers who found themselves targeted for their humanitarian activities. Khalil had become the foundation's operations coordinator for the Middle East, using his technical skills and local knowledge to establish secure communication networks and safe houses for medical personnel working in dangerous areas. His transformation from university student to international humanitarian coordinator had been remarkable to witness, and Amira often marveled at how the crisis that had disrupted their lives had also revealed strengths they had never known they possessed. "We became who we needed to become," he said during one of their planning meetings. "The war tried to destroy us, but instead it showed us what we were capable of." The relationship between Amira and Layla Haddad had evolved into something deeper and more honest than their original mother-daughter bond. The necessity of confronting painful truths about their family history had ultimately strengthened their connection, based now on mutual respect and shared commitment to healing rather than the protective deception that had characterized Amira's childhood. Layla had moved to Deir-ez-Zor to help with the memorial facility, using her administrative skills to coordinate international visitors and her knowledge of local customs to ensure that the memorial served the needs of the Syrian community as well as foreign researchers and activists. Her decision to live openly with the knowledge of her father's crimes, rather than hiding from them, had inspired other family members of war criminals to come forward with their own testimonies and attempts at reconciliation. "Shame," she told a gathering of relatives of convicted war criminals, "only has power over us if we let it remain hidden. When we bring it into the light and commit ourselves to making amends, it becomes a source of strength rather than weakness." The ripple effects of Amira's courage in holding that press conference continued to spread in ways both large and small. Medical schools around the world had incorporated the Strategic Defense Solutions case into their ethics curricula. International humanitarian law had been strengthened with new provisions specifically addressing the protection of medical facilities and personnel. Most importantly, a new generation of medical professionals was being trained to recognize and resist the militarization of their skills and knowledge. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of her mother's sacrifice came in the form of letters and visits from people whose lives had been touched by the revelation of the truth about strategic defense solutions. Survivors of chemical weapons attacks who had finally received acknowledgement and compensation for their suffering. Families of medical workers who had been killed for treating victims of experimental weapons who now knew that their loved ones' deaths had not been in vain. Young people who had been inspired to pursue careers in medicine, journalism, or human rights advocacy by the example of courage under pressure. One particularly moving encounter occurred during a medical conference in Istanbul, when an elderly Kurdish man approached Amira after her presentation on chemical weapons treatment protocols. "My village was attacked in 1988, he said in accented English, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. "My wife and 3 children died from the poison gas. For 35 years I have been told it was a normal attack, part of the war. But your mother's evidence showed that we were test subjects. Now my children's deaths have meaning. Now their suffering contributed to stopping these crimes. Thank you for giving their deaths purpose." Such encounters were both heartbreaking and inspiring, reminding Amira that the work of truth-telling was never just about exposing past crimes, but about honoring the victims and ensuring that their suffering led to meaningful change. The weight of carrying her mother's legacy had been enormous, but it had also connected her to a global community of people committed to justice and healing. 5 years after the press conference that had changed everything, Amira stood once again in the memorial garden, but this time she was not there as a speaker or advocate. She was there as a mother, holding her 6-month-old daughter and introducing her to the place where her grandmother's courage had first taken root. The baby, whom she had named Yasmin in honor of her mother, slept peacefully in her arms as Amira walked among the medicinal plants that had been carefully tended by generations of healers. The jasmine bush, where the evidence had been hidden, was now enormous, its white flowers filling the air with fragrance that carried memories of hope and determination. "This is where it all began," she whispered to her sleeping daughter. "This is where your grandmother chose truth over safety, where she planted the seeds of justice that we're still cultivating today." Fatima, now a fully qualified trauma surgeon and Amira's closest colleague, joined her in the garden with her own infant son. The 2 women sat together in the shade of an olive tree that had somehow survived decades of war and destruction, their children sleeping in their arms, while they discussed plans for expanding their medical training programs to include refugee camps throughout the region. "Sometimes I wonder what your mother would think of all this," Fatima said, gesturing toward the memorial facility that now served hundreds of medical students and researchers each year. "Do you think she could have imagined that hiding those documents in a garden would eventually lead to all this?" Amira considered the question, thinking about the woman in the photograph who had looked so much like her but had lived in such different circumstances. Captain Yasmin Al-Rashid had been young, frightened, and isolated when she had made the decision to document war crimes that could have gotten her killed. She had acted on faith rather than certainty, hope rather than knowledge of the outcome. "I think she knew that truth has its own power," Amira finally replied. She couldn't have known exactly how the seeds she planted would grow, but she trusted that they would grow. That's what courage really is, acting on faith that doing the right thing will eventually lead to good outcomes, even when you can't see how. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Mansouri, now walking slowly but still making her daily rounds through the garden to check on the medicinal plants. Despite her advanced age, she continued to teach, to research, and to serve as a living link between the generation that had witnessed the original crimes and the generation that was working to ensure they never happened again. "The afternoon light is perfect for teaching today," she announced, settling herself on a bench where she could address the small group of medical students who gathered daily for her informal lectures on traditional healing methods. "Who can tell me the difference between rosemary grown in alkaline soil versus acidic soil and how that affects its medicinal properties?" Watching her work, Amira was struck by the continuity of knowledge and care that connected past and present. Dr. Mansouri had trained Yasmin Al-Rashid in field surgery techniques that saved hundreds of lives. Yasmin had passed on her knowledge and values to her daughter through methods both deliberate and unconscious. Amira was now training Fatima and dozens of other young medical professionals who would carry the work forward into an uncertain future. The chain of healing stretched backward through generations of practitioners who had chosen to use their skills for helping rather than harming, and it stretched forward through the students who were learning not just medical techniques but the ethical framework that would guide their decisions throughout their careers. As the sun began to set over the memorial garden, casting long shadows between the rows of medicinal plants, Amira thought about the journey that had brought her from the young woman counting bullet holes in her bedroom wall to the mother and teacher she had become. The path had been difficult, often dangerous, sometimes heartbreaking, but it had also been filled with moments of connection, discovery, and hope that had made every risk worthwhile. The precision marksman unit that had surrounded her house that morning 5 years ago had been trying to bury the truth about systematic war crimes. Instead, their actions had set in motion a series of events that had exposed not just their immediate crimes, but an entire system of exploitation and experimentation that had caused suffering for decades. The 12 rounds that had missed her by inches had marked the beginning of her real life, not the protected, limited existence she had lived as Amira Haddad, but the purposeful, connected life she had built as Amira Al-Rashid. The bullets that should have ended her story had instead begun it, creating the circumstances that allowed her to discover her true identity and carry forward her mother's interrupted work. Standing in the garden where it all began, holding her daughter who would grow up knowing the truth about her family's history and her grandmother's courage, Amira felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work completed and work begun. The immediate crisis had been resolved, the truth had been told, the criminals had been prosecuted. But the larger work of healing, individual, collective, generational, would continue long after her own contributions were forgotten. "Mama," she whispered to the jasmine bush where her mother's evidence had waited for 37 years to be discovered, "I finished what you started, but more importantly, I made sure it won't end with me." The evening call to prayer drifted across the memorial garden, mixing with the laughter of children playing in the reconstructed neighborhood beyond the walls. Syria was healing, slowly and imperfectly, but healing nonetheless. And in a small corner of that healing, preserved in the careful documentation of atrocities and the patient training of new healers, the legacy of Captain Yasmin Al-Rashid continued to grow like the medicinal plants she had tended with such care so many years ago. The precision Marksman unit had surrounded her house that morning, intending to end a story of resistance and truth-telling. Instead, they had written the first chapter of a much larger story, one that would be told and retold in medical schools and human rights organizations, in courtrooms and memorial gardens, wherever people chose courage over comfort and truth over convenient silence. As darkness fell over Deir ez-Zor, Amira carried her sleeping daughter back toward the lights of the medical facility, already planning the next day's surgeries, the next group of students to train, the next steps in the endless work of healing. Behind her, the jasmine bush released its fragrance into the night air, a reminder that some truths, once planted, can survive any amount of darkness and bloom again when the time is right. The story that had begun with 12 bullets in a surrounded house had become something larger than any of its original participants could have imagined, a testament to the power of individual courage to create systemic change, and a promise that the work of healing would continue as long as there were people willing to carry it forward. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.